Have you ever been made to feel small by the very people who were supposed to build you up? Have you ever been told you were a failure, a nobody, by your own family? I have. And this is the story of how I served them a taste of their own medicine at the most expensive family dinner they ever had. The cold glass doors of the Blackwood Grand felt like a barrier to another world. On my side, the biting November wind and the gray, indifferent city. On their side, a universe of shimmering gold light, the low hum of champagne-fueled conversation, and the clinking of heavy silverware on fine china. I, Cassidy Miller, stood on the wrong side, clutching a small rectangular gift in my hands. The wrapping paper was from the discount store, and I'd used too much tape, making the corners lumpy. It felt clumsy and childish, just like I did. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the heavy door open. The warmth and the noise washed over me, a thick, suffocating wave. My father, Richard Miller, was at the center of it all, as always. His birthday party. He stood near the head of a long, elegantly set table, a glass of dark red wine in one hand, the other gesturing expansively as he held court. He was in his element, a king in his castle, surrounded by business associates who hung on his every word. He was boasting about his latest real estate deal, a new high-rise that would scrape the sky and cement his legacy. His voice was a deep, confident rumble that filled the private dining room. My eyes scanned the room, landing on my older sister Brittany. She saw me immediately, and her perfectly glossed lips curled into a faint, superior smile. She was everything I wasn't. Her dress was a sheath of dark blue silk that probably cost more than my rent for 3 months, and the diamonds on her ears and wrist caught the light, scattering tiny, mocking rainbows. She leaned over to her husband Mark and whispered something. He glanced at me, then quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching slightly. That was Mark's signature move. He was a professional at looking away. "Cassie, you made it," Brittany called out, her voice just a little too loud, drawing a few heads in our direction. "That's a quaint dress. Did you make it yourself?" The flush of heat on my cheeks was instant and familiar. My dress was a simple black one from a thrift store, the only thing I owned that felt appropriate. It was clean, it was neat, but next to her, I felt like a crow in a flock of peacocks. "Hello, Brittany." "Mark," I said, my voice tight. "Happy birthday, Dad," I managed, stepping forward into the circle of light around him. I held out my gift. My father turned, his eyes sweeping over me in a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in my worn coat, my simple dress, my hopeful face, and found all of it lacking. He took the gift from me without a word, his fingers barely brushing mine. He set his wine glass down and tore at the paper with an air of impatient obligation. He pulled out the simple silver frame. Inside was a photograph of the two of us, taken 20 years ago at a county fair. I was a little girl with a gapped-toothed smile, sitting on his shoulders, my small hands tangled in his hair. He was looking up at me, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. It was the last time I could remember him looking at me, with pure, uncomplicated pride, the last time I felt like I was his daughter, not his disappointment. He stared at the photo for a single, long second. No flicker of nostalgia crossed his face. No softness entered his eyes. His expression was as hard and polished as the marble floor beneath my feet. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the frame onto a side table laden with other, more expensive gifts. It landed with a dull clatter next to a box of Cuban cigars and a bottle of aged scotch. "Cassidy," he said, and his voice was so cold it felt like it could freeze the wine in the glasses. The jovial host was gone, replaced by the man I knew all too well. "We're celebrating success tonight. We're celebrating achievement." He gestured around the room, at the well-dressed guests, the opulent decor. "This is a night for winners." His eyes locked onto mine. "Frankly, your presence here is just an embarrassment. You chose to walk away from the opportunities I gave you. You chose to be a barista. You're a failure, Cassidy. A nobody." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. I could feel the eyes of the other guests on me, a mixture of pity, discomfort, and morbid curiosity. Brittany's snicker was a high, sharp sound. Mark was staring intently at his polished shoes, his silence a heavy weight of agreement. "You're not welcome here," my father finished, his voice dropping to a low, final command. He picked up his wineglass, turning his back to me, as if I had already vanished, as if I was nothing. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, choking pressure in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was tilting, the golden light blurring at the edges. "Please, just leave," he added, without looking at me. "Don't ruin my birthday." I turned, my body moving on autopilot. I walked past the long table, past the averted eyes and the hushed whispers. I didn't look at Brittany's triumphant smirk or Mark's cowardly avoidance. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stumbled back out into the cold night. The door swung shut behind me, cutting off the warm light, but I could still hear it, clear as a bell, a sound that would echo in my head for a long, long time, the sound of their laughter. The walk home felt like a punishment. A cold, drizzling rain had started, the kind that isn't heavy enough to wash anything away but just persistent enough to seep into your bones. I couldn't afford a cab. That was the simple, brutal truth of my life. The $10 or $12 for the ride was half a day's worth of groceries. So I walked, pulling my thin coat tighter, the laughter from the restaurant still ringing in my ears. Each step on the slick, cracked pavement was an echo of my father's words: failure, nobody, embarrassment. When I finally reached my apartment building, the contrast was almost laughable. I had just left a place where a single bottle of wine cost more than my entire monthly budget, a place of polished brass and uniformed doormen. My building had a flickering fluorescent light in the entryway that cast everything in a sickly green glow. The hallway smelled of dampness and a neighbor's boiled cabbage. My key stuck in the lock like it always did, and I had to jiggle it until it finally gave way. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the four walls of my failure. The paint on the walls was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the paler yellow of a previous tenant's life. The single window looked out onto a brick wall, so close I could almost touch it. On the small kitchen counter, a stack of envelopes sat like a silent accusation: overdue, final notice. The words were a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. I didn't turn on the main light. I didn't want to see it all too clearly. Instead, I flicked on the small lamp by my worn-out armchair, the only piece of furniture I truly owned. The rest was cheap, second-hand stuff that seemed to sag with the weight of its own history. I dropped my keys on the counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. My stomach growled, a hollow, empty ache that matched the one in my chest. Dinner was a packet of instant ramen. I stood over the sink, pouring the boiling water from my electric kettle into the styrofoam cup, watching the hard, brittle noodles slowly soften. I didn't even have the energy to sit down. I just stood there, under the weak light of the stove hood, and ate the salty, artificial soup with a fork. It was hot, and it was something that was the best I could say about it. And that's when the tears finally came. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs. They were silent, hot tears that tracked paths through the steam on my face and dripped into my soup. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the dark kitchen window, my face pale and streaked, my eyes red, and in that moment, I saw exactly what my father saw: a loser. A 26-year-old woman eating ramen over a sink in a rundown apartment, a woman who had been kicked out of her own father's birthday party. My life was a frantic, exhausting cycle. I was a barista by day, forcing a smile for strangers as I frothed milk and called out names, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to my clothes. By night, I was a data entry clerk for a faceless logistics company, my eyes burning as I stared at spreadsheets on a computer screen in a dim, soulless office cubicle. 2 jobs, 60 hours a week, and I was still trapped. I was running as fast as I could on a treadmill, going nowhere. Just last week, I'd found the notice taped to my door. It was a formal eviction warning, printed on stark red paper. I was 2 months behind on rent. I had to go to my landlord, Mr. Henderson, a different, much less affluent Henderson than the one my father was schmoozing tonight, and beg. I stood in his cramped, cluttered office, my hands clenched, my pride a distant memory. I had to plead for a 1-week extension, promising him I'd have the money, though I had no idea how. He'd looked at me with weary eyes, a man who had heard 1,000 stories just like mine, and finally mercifully agreed. That 1 week was almost up. The weight of it all pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. This was rock bottom. This was the life I had chosen, according to my father. But I hadn't chosen this. I had chosen not to be him. I had chosen not to live a life measured in square footage and dollar signs. A life where kindness was a liability and family was a business transaction. But in escaping his world, I had stumbled into this one. A world of quiet desperation, where the only sound was the drip of a leaky faucet and the mocking laughter in my own memory. I finished the last of the noodles, the salty broth doing nothing to fill the emptiness inside me. I rinsed the cup and fork and left them in the sink, too tired to do anything more. I was adrift, and the shore was so far away I couldn't even see it anymore. My father hadn't just kicked me out of his party. He had confirmed the deepest, darkest fear I had about myself. That maybe, just maybe, he was right. A few days later, I was at my breaking point. The landlord's 1-week extension was a ticking clock, and every tick was a step closer to having my life packed into boxes and dumped on the sidewalk. I was sorting through a small box of my late grandmother's things, looking for anything I could possibly sell. My grandmother, Eleanor, had been the one bright spot in the Miller family constellation. She was whip-smart, a savvy investor who had built her own small fortune long before my father made his first million. He'd always resented her for it, for her quiet confidence in the fact that she saw right through his bluster. More than that, he resented that she loved me for who I was, not for who he wanted me to be. As my fingers sifted through old letters and faded photographs, they brushed against a small, stiff piece of cardstock. I pulled it out. It was an old business card, thick and embossed, a relic from a time when such things had weight. Arthur Vance, Private Equity and Strategic Ventures. Arthur had been my grandmother's oldest friend and business partner. I remembered him from her funeral. A tall, kind-faced man with eyes that seemed to see everything. He had told me then, "Your grandmother believed in you more than anyone. Don't ever forget that." I stared at the card. A phone number was printed in crisp, black ink. It was a long shot. He probably wouldn't even remember me. What would I even say? "Hello, you don't know me, but my life is falling apart and I'm about to be homeless?" The thought was mortifying. But as I looked around my tiny, bleak apartment, at the peeling paint and the stack of bills, a wave of desperation washed over me, drowning out my pride. What did I have to lose? My hand was shaking as I dialed the number. It rang twice and I was about to hang up when a voice answered, calm and steady. "Arthur Vance." "Mr. Vance?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. This is Cassidy Miller, Eleanor's granddaughter." There was a pause and my heart sank. He didn't remember, but then, his voice softened with recognition. "Cassidy. Of course. I remember you. You have your grandmother's eyes. How are you, my dear?" The simple kindness in his voice was my undoing. The dam I had so carefully constructed inside me just broke. A sob escaped my lips and then another. I sank down onto my threadbare armchair, the phone pressed hard against my ear, and I told him everything. The whole ugly, humiliating story. My father's birthday party, the words he used, the laughter, the 2 dead-end jobs, the eviction notice. The words tumbled out of me in a messy, tearful rush. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. He let the silence sit for a moment after I was done, a respectful silence, not an awkward one. There was no pity in his voice when he finally spoke, only a quiet strength that felt like a lifeline. "Cassidy," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Your grandmother always said you had the sharpest mind in the family. She told me once, 'Richard knows how to pour concrete, but Cassie knows where the ground is solid.' Your father is a builder, but you're a strategist. You just haven't been given a chance to play the game." I sniffled, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. "A strategist who is about to get evicted." He chuckled softly. "Strategy sometimes requires a change in battlefield. Listen to me. There's an opportunity, it's small, something your father would overlook, because it isn't glamorous. It's a distressed commercial property over on the east side. A small block of storefronts. The owner passed away, the heirs are fighting, and the bank just wants it off its books. It's ugly, it's neglected. But the bones are good. The zoning is flexible. No one wants it, which is precisely why it's perfect." I was confused. "What does that have to do with me? I don't have any money, Mr. Vance." "Call me Arthur," he corrected gently. "And you have something more valuable than money. You have that mind your grandmother was so proud of. I'm going to make you a proposition. I will co-sign a small business loan for you to acquire it. This isn't a gift, Cassidy. This is an investment, a high-risk one, I'll admit. I'm not investing in the property. I'm investing in you. I'm betting that your grandmother was right." I was stunned into silence. Someone was offering to bet on me. Me. The failure. The nobody. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope ignited in the darkness. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice trembling but with something new in it. Not despair. Determination. "You have to work harder than you've ever worked in your life," Arthur said, his voice now all business. "You have to learn everything you can about that property and the neighborhood around it. You have to be smarter and faster than everyone else. Can you do that?" I looked around my crumbling apartment, at the symbol of my defeat. This was my chance. Not just to survive, but to fight back. "Yes," I said, the word clear and strong. "Yes, I can." The moment I hung up the phone with Arthur, a switch flipped inside me. The fog of despair began to burn away, replaced by the hot, clear fire of purpose. The next day, I walked into the soulless office of the logistics company and quit my data entry job. The manager barely looked up. To him, I was just another cog in the machine, easily replaced. He had no idea he was letting go of the future founder and CEO of CM Holdings. My life became a secret war, fought on two fronts. During the day, I was still Cassie the barista, smiling and serving coffee, saving every single dollar I could. But my nights and every other waking moment belonged to my new venture, my tiny apartment, transformed from a prison of failure into a war room. I covered one of the peeling walls with a large city map, marking it up with colored pins and notes. My old, slow laptop, which had once been a source of shame, became my most powerful weapon. The work was grueling. I spent hours upon hours at the public library, poring over dusty books on zoning laws, municipal codes, and commercial real estate contracts. I created detailed market analysis reports, forecasting potential revenue streams from different types of tenants. I learned about renovation costs, permit applications, and property taxes. I lived on cheap coffee and the adrenaline of my secret mission. The hardest part was dealing with the contractors. When I started making calls to get quotes for the renovation, I was met with a wall of condescension. They heard my young, female voice and immediately dismissed me. They quoted me outrageous prices, spoke to me in simplistic terms as if I were a child, or just didn't call back at all. I learned quickly to be tougher, to be more prepared. I'd walk into meetings armed with spreadsheets and data, my voice firm, My question sharp. Slowly, I earned their grudging respect. There were moments of near failure. An unexpected plumbing issue threatened to derail the whole project, requiring an extra few $1,000s I didn't have. My savings were gone. The loan was maxed out. For one desperate, panicked night, I thought it was all over. The next morning, with a heavy heart, I took the one piece of valuable jewelry I owned to a pawn shop. It was a simple gold necklace with a small sapphire pendant, a gift from my grandmother for my 16th birthday. Handing it over to the gruff man behind the counter felt like a betrayal. But as he counted out the cash, I told myself this wasn't a defeat. It was a sacrifice, a necessary casualty in a war I was determined to win. One evening, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I answered it anyway. Cassie? The voice was hesitant. It was Mark, my brother-in-law. Mark? Is everything okay? I asked, my guard immediately up. Yeah, everything's fine, he said quickly. Listen, your mom wanted me to call, just to, check in, see how you're doing. I could hear the lie in his voice. My mother hadn't wanted him to call. My father had ordered it, using my mother as a cover. It was a reconnaissance mission. I'm fine, Mark, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Good, he mumbled. So, you still at that coffee shop? Did you find a real job yet? The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. A real job, in their world, meant a six-figure salary and a corner office in a building my father approved of. I'm managing, I said. Well, that's great, he said, with no sincerity whatsoever. Hey, so, we have some news. Brittany's pregnant. He sounded genuinely happy for the first time in the conversation. And your dad, he's buying us a new house. Bigger place, for the baby. It's a great neighborhood. He was dangling their success in front of my face, a shiny lure meant to highlight my own pathetic situation. He wasn't overtly cruel like Brittany or my father, but his weakness, his enabling silence was a cruelty all its own. He was a willing foot soldier in their campaign against me, terrified of losing the comfortable lifestyle his marriage afforded him. That's nice for you, Mark, I said, my voice tight. The call ended soon after, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. But as I hung up, the anger didn't crush me. It fueled me. I turned back to the map on my wall, to the spreadsheets on my laptop. They were getting a new house. Fine. I was building an empire, and they had no idea. 6 months after my secret war began, the tide turned. It happened on a Tuesday. I had finally completed the renovations on the small block of storefronts. The ugly, neglected building was transformed. With fresh paint, new windows, and modern signage, it was now the most attractive property on the street. The final step was leasing out the 3 commercial units. My market research told me there was a desperate need in the neighborhood for a good bakery, a laundromat, and a small grocery store. I had targeted my advertising specifically to find them. The phone calls started coming in. And then, in one incredible week, it happened. I signed leases for all 3 units, not just with any tenants, but with the perfect tenants. A young couple starting their dream bakery, a family who had run a successful laundromat in another state, a local entrepreneur opening a community-focused market. The rental income was even higher than my most optimistic projections. After the final lease was signed, and the deposit checks were in my hand, I walked out of my lawyer's office and just stood on the sidewalk, blinking in the bright afternoon sun. I had done it. I had taken a forgotten, ugly duckling of a property and turned it into a beautiful, profitable swan. It wasn't a massive fortune, not by my father's standards, but it was real, and more importantly, it was mine. Every single penny was the result of my own sweat, my own sleepless nights, my own mind. The first person I called was Arthur. I found a bench in a nearby park and dialed his number, my heart hammering against my ribs. Arthur, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's done. We're fully leased. I could hear the smile in his voice. We are we? And how do the numbers look, Miss Miller? He teased. I read him the figures, the rental income, the profit margin. There was a moment of silence on his end, and then a low whistle. Cassidy, that's incredible, he said, all traces of teasing gone, replaced by genuine awe. That's a 30% higher return than I projected. Your grandmother was right. You're a natural. Hearing that pride in his voice, that validation from the one person who had bet on me, was more satisfying than the money itself. I couldn't have done it without you, Arthur, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You did the work, kid, he replied. I just opened the door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it. The very next day, I walked into the bank and paid back the entire loan he had co-signed, with all the accrued interest. The bank officer looked at me with new respect. With the remaining capital, I took the biggest leap of my life. I walked into a small, nondescript office building downtown and signed a 1-year lease on a tiny one-room office. It was barely bigger than a closet, with a single window that looked out onto an air shaft. But it was. I bought a used desk, a chair, and a new, faster laptop. Then I went to the county clerk's office and filed the paperwork. I was no longer just Cassidy Miller, the barista. I was Cassidy Miller, the founder and CEO of my own discreet investment firm, CM Holdings. The name was simple, anonymous. No one would connect it to the failure of the Miller family. Sitting in that tiny office, the smell of fresh paint in the air, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never known. This was the first brick. My father built skyscrapers of steel and logs, monuments to his own ego, but I had laid the foundation of something else, something he could never see, never touch, and never, ever take away from me. I was no longer a failure. I was a founder, and my secret war had just become an empire in the making. Months melted into a year. CM Holdings operated in the shadows, a ghost in the city's bustling real estate market. I repeated my formula, moving with a speed and precision that startled the old guard. I found undervalued properties, the ones the big players like my father deemed too small or too complicated. I used my analytical skills to see the hidden potential, the strategic value they missed. I bought a small, forgotten warehouse and pre-leased it to a tech startup before I even closed the deal. I acquired a portfolio of small apartment buildings, streamlined their management, and tripled their profitability. My reputation in certain investment circles began to grow, but always under the discreet banner of CM Holdings. To the world, I was a name on a document, a mysterious and aggressive new player. No one knew that the powerhouse behind the company was a 20-something woman working from a closet-sized office, a woman who still poured coffee a few mornings a week to maintain her cover. The duality of my life was exhausting, but exhilarating. I was living a double life, and the secret was my shield and my sword. One crisp autumn afternoon, my private line rang. It was Arthur. He never called without a purpose. Cassidy, he said, his voice low and charged with an energy I recognized. It was the sound of opportunity. Are you sitting down? I am now, I said, pulling my chair closer to my desk. What's going on, Arthur? Something has come onto the market. Not officially. It's being shopped very, very quietly. The kind of deal that happens in whispers before anyone else even knows there's blood in the water. My pulse quickened. These were the deals we lived for. The current owner of the Blackwood Grand, he said, letting the name hang in the air. I felt the air leave my lungs. The Blackwood Grand, the stage of my deepest humiliation. The glittering golden tomb where my father had buried me with his words. What about it? I managed to ask, my voice tight. He over-leveraged himself on a resort project in the Caribbean, Arthur explained. It went bust. The banks are calling in his loans. And they're calling them in hard. He needs to liquidate his prime assets. And he needs to do it fast and quietly to avoid a public panic that would devalue everything else. He's selling the entire building, the restaurant, the event spaces, the penthouse on top, everything. My mind was reeling. It felt like a twist of fate so perfect, so poetic, that it couldn't possibly be real. The universe wasn't just offering me a business opportunity, it was offering me justice on a silver platter. The idea sparked in my mind, a thought so audacious, so terrifyingly bold. It made my hands tremble. I could buy it. I could own the very floorboards where I had been told I was worthless. I could own the crystal chandeliers that had looked down on my shame. I could become the queen of the castle, from which I had been exiled. Cassidy? Are you still there? Arthur's voice cut through my thoughts. I'm here, I breathed. Arthur, I want it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing the sheer, beautiful audacity of it. Then, a slow, deep chuckle. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. I had a feeling that this wasn't just about the numbers for you, this is personal. It's the ultimate leverage, I said, the words tasting like victory already. The suspense was a physical thing, a tight coil in my stomach. This was more than a real estate deal. This was the end game. This was my chance to rewrite the story, to take the most painful chapter of my life and build my throne right on top of it. The idea was terrifying. It would take everything I had, and more. But the thought of my father standing in that restaurant, not as a king holding court, but as a guest in a building that I owned, that thought was worth any risk. Buying the Blackwood Grand was not like buying a forgotten warehouse. This was the crown jewel of the city's real estate, and acquiring it was a battle. The process was a grueling, high-stakes gauntlet that tested every ounce of my resolve. It would require every dollar of capital CM Holdings had accumulated, plus a significant, multi-million-dollar loan from a major bank. This was the final test. This was the leap from being a clever, small-time player to being a force to be reckoned with. The first meeting at the bank was a disaster. I walked into a boardroom with a long, polished table and a panel of stern-faced men in dark suits. They looked at my presentation, at the solid numbers and flawless projections of CM Holdings. Then they looked at me. They saw a 26-year-old woman in a simple, practical suit. They saw youth. They saw inexperience. They didn't see the strategist who had outmaneuvered seasoned players for the past year. Their questions were patronizing, their skepticism a thick, suffocating blanket. Are you sure you're ready for a property of this magnitude, Miss Miller? One of them asked, his tone dripping with condescension. I left that meeting, feeling battered and bruised. The voices of my family, the ones I had worked so hard to silence, came roaring back. Failure. Nobody. Useless. They were right. Who was I to think I could pull this off? The doubt festered for days. The deal was on the line, and my confidence was crumbling. One afternoon, I was supposed to have a final meeting with the bank to present my revised financing structure. I drove to the bank and parked my old, beaten-up car across the street. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the imposing glass and steel facade of the bank building. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face that condescending boardroom again. The fear of failure was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. My family's words echoed in my head, a chorus of mockery, my father's sneer, Brittany's laugh. They had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't good enough, and in that moment, sitting in my rusty car, I believed them. My hand was shaking as I picked up my phone and called Arthur. My voice cracked when he answered. I can't do it, Arthur, I whispered, the words tasting like defeat. They don't take me seriously. They look at me and they see a little girl playing dress-up. Maybe they're right. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought he was going to agree with me, to tell me I'd aimed too high. But when he spoke, his voice was as solid as granite. Cassidy, he said, his tone sharp and clear, cutting through my self-pity. Let me ask you a question. Are you going to let their words define your future? Or is your success going to define their past? I didn't answer. They called you a nobody, he continued, his voice rising with passion. Is that who you are? A nobody who turned a forgotten dump into a gold mine. A nobody who built a multi-million-dollar investment firm from nothing in a year. No, you are the owner of your destiny, Cassidy. You are the master of your own life. Now stop sitting in that car feeling sorry for yourself. You walk into that bank, you look those men in the eye, and you don't ask for their money. You tell them why giving it to you is the smartest decision they'll make all year. Now go buy that building. His words were like a jolt of electricity. He was right. I had let their ghosts into my head. I had let them sit in the driver's seat. No more. I took a deep breath, the steel returning to my spine. I hung up the phone, got out of my car, and walked across the street. I strode into that bank, not as a hopeful girl asking for a favor, but as the CEO of CM Holdings. I walked into that boardroom, and I didn't just present my case. I owned it. And 2 hours later, I walked out with the loan secured. The deal was mine. The day the deal closed, I didn't celebrate with champagne or a fancy dinner. I waited until late at night, long after the last diners had left, and the staff had gone home. I used the master key I'd been given to let myself into the Blackwood Grand. The cavernous dining room was dark and silent, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 conversations. The air was still thick with the faint scent of expensive perfume and rich food. I walked through the room, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I ran my hand along the polished wood of the bar, along the crisp linen of a tablecloth. I stood on the exact spot where I had offered my father that small framed photograph. The memory of his sneer, of his cold dismissal, was still there, a faint whisper in the silent room, but it had no power over me anymore. It was just a scene from a story whose ending I was now in control of. The keys in my hand felt heavy, real. This was mine. All of it. I wasn't just the owner. I was the boss. The next morning, I met with the general manager, a polished and professional man named Mr. Dubois, who had been with the restaurant for 20 years. I introduced myself not as Cassidy Miller, but as the representative for the new ownership group, CM Holdings. I told him that the transition was to be seamless. Nothing would change for the staff or the day-to-day operations. The Blackwood Grand would continue to be the Blackwood Grand. There is, however, one new policy, I said, my voice calm and firm. All major private event bookings, especially full buyouts of the main dining room, are now to be personally approved by the ownership. All final decisions on these events will come directly through me. He looked surprised, but nodded. Of course, ma'am. To the rest of the world, I remained a ghost. I kept my tiny rented office. I kept my modest apartment in the rundown building. I kept driving my old car. The contrast was a secret thrill. In the mornings, I would leave my apartment, where the landlord was now greeting me with a friendly smile because my rent was paid 3 months in advance, and drive to a coffee shop. And in the afternoons, I would be on a conference call finalizing a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I was a queen, living in a rented room, a general directing a war from a secret bunker. I was biding my time, polishing my armor, and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal myself. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my family would be the ones to hand me that moment on a silver platter. It came almost a year to the day after my public banishment. It arrived in my mailbox, a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name and address, written in elegant, looping calligraphy. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside, an embossed invitation requested the pleasure of my company at a party, celebrating the 61st birthday of Mr. Richard Miller. It was more than just a birthday. The invitation also proudly announced a new partnership between Miller Development and the prestigious Henderson Capital, a major investment firm out of Chicago. And then, I saw the line at the bottom, the one that made a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Venue, the Blackwood Grand. Of course, it was perfect. My father, in his arrogance, had chosen my stage to celebrate his own triumph. He had no idea he was a fly walking into a spider's web. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was Brittany. "Cassie, hi," she said, her voice dripping with the fake, sugary sweetness she used when she was about to be particularly cruel. "Did you get the invitation?" "I did," I said, keeping my voice a carefully neutral canvas. "Good. Look, Dad felt sorry for you," she said. The lie so blatant it was almost funny. "He knows things have been hard for you, and he said we should give you one more chance to act like part of the family. A sort of reunion. A chance. As if she were a queen bestowing a royal favor upon a peasant. Just try to look presentable, okay?" she added, unable to resist one last little jab. "Mr. Henderson will be there. He's a very important man, and we want to make a good impression." I leaned back in my chair in my tiny secret office, looking at the city skyline through my one small window. I thought of the property deed locked in my safe. I thought of the general manager who answered to me. I thought of the power I held, a coiled spring ready to be released. "Don't worry, Brittany," I said, my voice smooth as silk. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." I hung up the phone. She thought she was offering me a crumb of charity, a seat at the foot of their table. She had no idea she had just personally invited me to my own coronation. The final act was about to begin. I chose my armor carefully. It wasn't a gown dripping with jewels or a dress that screamed for attention. It was a simple, impeccably tailored sheath dress, in a deep charcoal gray. It spoke not of wealth but of confidence. It was the kind of dress a woman who owned the room would wear. My only jewelry was my grandmother's sapphire necklace, which I had bought back from the pawnshop months ago. It rested against my collarbone, a cool, steady reminder of the sacrifice that had brought me here. When I walked into the main dining room of the Blackwood Grand, it was exactly as I had pictured it. The room was buzzing, filled with the city's elite, and at the center of it all, my father, Richard, was laughing, his arm draped around a sharp, silver-haired man I recognized from my research as Mr. Henderson, the neutral observer in this play. My sister, Brittany, pregnant and glowing with smug satisfaction, stood beside her husband Mark. They saw me enter, and the familiar pattern began immediately. Brittany's eyes swept over me, a flicker of surprise in them that I didn't look as pathetic as she'd hoped. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, her voice a stage whisper loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Still driving that old wreck, Cassie. I'm surprised it made it all the way downtown." Mark shuffled his feet, staring at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man perpetually caught between his conscience and his comfort. My father turned, giving me a curt nod. "Cassidy, glad you could make it. Try not to embarrass us tonight. Mr. Henderson is a very important guest." Mr. Henderson extended a hand, his smile polite but his eyes dismissive. "A pleasure to meet you, Cassidy," he said, his handshake brief. It was clear my father had already fed him the family narrative. This was the black sheep, the failure, the charity case they had to tolerate. I was a footnote in their story of success. I just smiled. A calm, serene smile that seemed to unnerve them more than any argument would have. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Henderson. It's a wonderful party, Dad." I took my seat at the far end of the table, the seat reserved for the unimportant, and I waited. I watched them work the room. I listened as my father gave a grand, self-congratulatory speech about his life's work, his legacy of steel and glass. He spoke of his new partnership with Henderson Capital as the crowning achievement of his career. Then, he raised his glass, his eyes finding mine across the long, candlelit table. "A toast," he boomed, his voice resonating with authority. "To building things that last, to creating a legacy, and to understanding that success is the only thing that matters. It's not about finding yourself, it's about building a future. It's certainly not about being a useless drain on society." The jab was so direct, so public, that a ripple of uncomfortable silence went through the guests nearest our table. They glanced at me with pity. Mr. Henderson's polite mask didn't slip, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Confirmation. He believed he was witnessing a sad family drama, with me as the tragic, wayward daughter. The humiliation was a familiar cloak, but tonight, it didn't fit. It slid right off me. They thought they were putting me in my place, cementing my status as the family failure in front of a powerful audience. They had no idea they were just setting the stage for me. I took a slow sip of my water, held my father's gaze, and allowed a small, knowing smile to touch my lips. The overture was over. It was time for the crescendo. The last syllable of my father's toast was still hanging in the air when it began. The general manager of the Blackwood Grand, Mr. Dubois, emerged from the direction of the kitchens. He walked with a quiet purpose, his path straight and direct. My father, assuming the manager was coming to congratulate him, puffed out his chest and turned with a magnanimous smile. But Mr. Dubois didn't even glance at him. His eyes were fixed on me. At the far end of the table, he stopped beside my chair, bowing his head slightly. The entire table fell silent, watching this bizarre turn of events. "Miss Miller," Mr. Dubois said, his voice respectful and clear, easily carrying in the sudden quiet. "We are ready for the private fireworks display on your command, ma'am." The word "ma'am" dropped into the silence like a stone into a perfectly still pond. My entire family froze. My father's jaw, which had been set in a triumphant grin, literally dropped open. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, mottled gray. He looked from Mr. Dubois to me and back again, his mind unable to process what he had just heard. Brittany's manicured hand, holding a champagne flute, stopped halfway to her lips. She was completely speechless, her eyes wide with disbelief. Beside her, Mark looked like he was going to be physically sick. He turned pale, a sickly green shade under the restaurant's warm lights, and he looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. What did you call her?" my father stammered, his voice a hoarse, strangled whisper. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Her? She's a nobody." Before I could answer, a calm, familiar voice cut through the tension. "She's the owner, Richard." Every head turned. Arthur Vance, my ally, my mentor, who had been sitting quietly at a nearby table as my guest, stood up and walked over. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who held all the cards. In his hand was a simple, dark blue folder. He placed it on the white linen tablecloth in front of my father, with a soft, definitive thud. "You talk a lot about building things, Richard," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a quiet authority that commanded the attention of the entire room. "But you seem to have missed the biggest deal in town for the past year." With a shaking hand, my father opened the folder. Inside, nestled on top of a stack of legal documents, was a single sheet of paper. It was the property deed for the entire Blackwood Grand building, for the ground beneath our feet, for the walls around us, for the glittering chandeliers above our heads. And at the top of the page, in stark, official print, was the name of the sole proprietor, Cassidy Miller, owner. A choked sound escaped my father's throat. He stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The blood had completely drained from his face. He looked a decade older, a hollowed-out version of the Titan he'd been moments before. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop, and then another figure rose from the table. It was Mr. Henderson, the neutral observer. He had been watching this entire exchange with the sharp, analytical gaze of a top-tier investor. He looked from the deed in my father's trembling hand to me, his expression transformed from polite dismissal to wide-eyed, staggering shock, which then morphed into something else entirely, profound respect. He cleared his throat, and his voice was crisp and decisive. "Mr. Miller," he said, addressing my father but looking at me, "I believe my firm has been in talks with the wrong person." He then turned his full attention to me, his posture shifting from that of a guest to that of a peer. "Ms. Miller," he said, the name now carrying its proper weight, "it seems you are the real power here. Your name has been on our radar for a while. CM Holdings is notoriously private, I had no idea. I'd be very interested in discussing a partnership with your company. His words were a cannon blast, shattering the last of my family's public facade. His validation in front of this audience was the final, undeniable proof of my victory. He hadn't just witnessed my reveal, he had publicly legitimized it, shifting the balance of power in the room so completely and irrevocably that my family was left utterly isolated in their ruin. I finally looked at my father. His world had not just been shaken, it had been demolished. The foundation he had built his entire identity on, money, power, status, had been ripped out from under him by the very person he had deemed worthless. I leaned forward, my voice low and calm, meant for him alone. "You said I wasn't welcome at your birthday, Dad," I said, the words cool and precise. "But you're the guest at mine." The aftermath was pure, beautiful chaos. Brittany was the first to snap. Her face, which had been a frozen mask of shock, contorted into a mask of rage. She rounded on our father, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek that echoed through the now whispering dining room. "How could you let this happen?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to be the smart one, the powerful one. How could you let her," she spat the word, pointing a trembling finger at me, "do this to us?" My father didn't answer. He was just sitting there, completely shocked, staring at the property deed in front of him, as if it were written in a language he couldn't comprehend. The confident, blustering patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed, defeated old man. The guests at the surrounding tables were no longer even pretending not to stare. They were whispering, their eyes wide, watching the spectacular public implosion of the Miller family dynasty. Their perceptions, so carefully curated by my father for decades, had been shattered in less than 5 minutes. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the building burn. My victory wasn't in their humiliation. It was in my own ascension. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I gave Mr. Henderson a small professional nod. "My assistant will be in touch to schedule a meeting," I said, pulling a sleek minimalist business card from my purse. It read, "Cassidy Miller, founder and CEO, CM Holdings." He took it as if it were a precious artifact. Then I turned to Arthur. He was smiling, a deep, genuine smile of immense pride. I walked over and gave him a brief, heartfelt hug. "Thank you," I whispered. "You did this, Cassidy," he whispered back. "You did this all on your own." And with that, I turned and walked away. I walked through the silent, staring crowd, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could their shattered world behind me, and I could feel my new world waiting for me ahead. I didn't go back to my small, cramped apartment. Instead, I took the private elevator, the one I now had a key for, all the way to the top floor. I let myself into the penthouse suite, a sprawling, magnificent space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the entire city. This was my new home. I walked out onto the private terrace, the cool night air feeling clean and fresh. Far below, the city lights glittered like a carpet of scattered jewels. And then, a brilliant flash of gold lit up the sky, followed by a shower of red and blue sparks. The fireworks I had commanded were beginning. They exploded silently in the distance, beautiful and fleeting. A celebration just for me. The pain was gone. The years of being called a failure, a nobody, a loser, all of it had just been fuel. The humiliation had been a whetstone, sharpening me for this exact moment. Looking out at the vast, sprawling city, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. This was never just a war with my family. It was a war with the person they had tried to make me believe I was. And tonight, I hadn't just won. I had conquered. My story is proof that the labels other people put on you don't have to become your reality. They called me a failure, a nobody, a loser, but I knew my own worth, even when I was the only one who did. True power isn't about inheriting a name, it's about building your own. What labels have you refused to accept in your own life? Have you ever had to prove someone wrong who should have been in your corner? Let me know your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them. And if this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of writing your own ending, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice and empowerment. Thanks for watching.